Hello, everyone. How are you doing? The heat wave finally caught up with us in Maryland. I think it's 96 outside, but the heat index is like 109. So I'm obviously recording this inside. So here we are. We've arrived at Module 7, Progress. So this week we're going to be talking about the progress in Latin America. Born in Blood and Fire, Chapter 6. John Charles Chastain's excellent book. So this is the time period. Let's see. Oh, I don't have it here. Basically, it's from about 1880 through 1930, if I remember correctly. A 50-year period of rapid progress in Latin America. So I'm going to jump right in and let's go. So conservatism reached a high point in Latin America around 1850. Over the next 25, let me correct myself. I guess this is from about 1850 through about 1880. Okay, that's the period of time we're talking about, which is a time of liberal progress. Over the next 25 years, liberals made a comeback and oversaw a long period of export-driven economic expansion. The liberal comeback was part of a pendulum swing between the conservative and liberal ideologies. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing in Europe and the United States. Of course, remember when we're using the word liberal here, we're not using it in the contemporary political sense. We're talking about classical liberalism, which is an emphasis on free trade and restricted governments with checks and balances, republican government, separation of church and state, etc. And so they were during this time period in Latin America, that is after 1850, when conservatism began to recede and liberalism began to emerge more triumphant. There was a transportation revolution. This was a huge part of the development of Latin America, especially in the area of railroads and steamships. Steam-powered ships plowed the oceans much faster and more reliably than did wind-powered ships. For some reason, that's a hard sentence to say, but I will not try to repeat it. Steam-powered trains were faster and more efficient than pack mules or ox-drawn carts. If you remember, the silver mine of Potosi was at the top of a mountain of silver in what is now Bolivia. It was so high, I think it was at 12,000 feet or higher. They were unable to grow their own food up there. And so all of the food to feed all the mine workers in Potosi, Bolivia, was grown down at the lower altitudes and shipped up to the top of Potosi on mule trains. And that was at one point was one of the largest cities in all of Latin America because of the silver strike. And then, of course, the silver, once it was mined and processed, had to be packed back down the mountain on these mule trains, and often taken on mule train to the coast to be loaded onto ships to be shipped to Panama, that is the Pacific coast of Panama, then unloaded again off of a ship and carried across Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, on another mule train, and then reloaded back onto a ship in the Caribbean, which would then sail to Havana and then on to Europe. So mules were very important in the time period previous to 1850, but after 1850, Latin American nations began to build railroads to ship their products to their ports. And this, of course, was a economic revolution, because whether it was silver from Potosi or Guanajuato, Mexico, or it was coffee in Brazil, or it was cattle and leather and hides, meat packing in Argentina, being able to get it to the port in trains and then shipped by steam-powered ships to Europe or United States was a great advantage. By 1874, the transatlantic telegraph cable connected Brazil with Europe. It's hard for us to imagine now what a revolution this was in that time period. So here's a picture of the trains. I think we saw this last week. Railroads and trestles. This might be Peru or Bolivia, but it could easily be Colombia, where I've traveled some of these mountain roads. And there's the process of laying the transatlantic telegraph cable. I will add to this that there was also the development of refrigeration technology, which was especially significant for Argentina because it had cattle in abundance. And before refrigeration, Argentina had to ship its products in the form of dried meats or leather goods, hides. But after the development of refrigeration and steamships, they were actually able to ship meat, beef, to other countries. Here's a picture of liberal versus conservative conflicts at mid-century in Latin America. And you see there up in Mexico, the War of Reform and Intervention, civil wars in Mexico. There was conflict in Haiti. The Dominican Republic, not Haiti. And then it's several in Central America. We'll talk about at least one of those. Also in the coast of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. Smaller conflicts in Bolivia and Chile. And then wars against Juan Manuel de Rosas, who we've talked about, was the caudillo of the 1840s. And also Brazilian regional rebellions against the central government. So quite a bit of conflict during this time period. In the mid-1800s, progress was becoming a sort of secular religion, and liberals were its prophets, and salvation was going to come through education. And the future would get brighter and brighter, and there would be a steady linear progress for humanity into a utopian future. If you watch Star Trek, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, Star Trek Second Generation especially. If you watch Star Trek, this is basically the idea of the liberal idea of what humanity will be like in 3 or 4 centuries with this unlimited progress. Upwardly mobile families tended to join the Liberal Party, whereas long-established status made other families conservatives. Liberals continued their opposition to the Catholic Church, its wealth, power, its abuses. Liberals represented change, and the church symbolized the past. To the conservatives, the past was attractive. So the conservatives embraced the Hispanic heritage, and they saw the Catholic Church as part of that heritage. They favored all things Spanish or Hispanic. They favored Catholicism, and they favored the military. The liberal, on the other hand, agitating for more rapid change, opposed the Catholic Church, its wealth, its power, and its abuses. They were anti-clerical. That does not mean necessarily anti-religious. A liberal party member could be a Catholic in good standing and a believer, but they just felt anti-clerical means believing that the Catholic Church should not be involved in politics. Opposition to the monarchy was another liberal point of view, which obviously presented a problem for some of the liberals in Brazil because they were living under the one successful monarchy in Latin America. Liberals also favored a constitutional republic and favored free markets and laissez-faire. We've already talked about Santa Anna, who was an extreme example of a Latin American caudillo. I don't know if I got him into the wrong chapter last time, or if he's just that important he comes up in 2 chapters. I guess because we're going to be talking about Mexican history here. Santa Anna was like the original caudillo. He was an opportunist. He was ambitious, probably a narcissist. He repeatedly switched sides between liberals and conservatives. He was president or dictator of Mexico so many times that historians debate the actual number, but at least 6 times from 1832 to 1855. He was the man most responsible for the loss of Texas and eventually New Mexico, Arizona, and California to the United States, the Behemoth del Norte. And then Benito Juarez is a different story. Juarez is a national hero in Mexico. He's viewed somewhat like Abraham Lincoln is viewed in the United States. We'll talk more about him in a moment. So in the Mexican case, you had the ongoing battle between liberals and conservatives, just like in other parts of Latin America. Religion and politics had always gone hand in hand in Mexico, which means that the Catholic Church of Mexico was probably the most powerful national Catholic Church in Latin America, which usually guarantees a backlash. And so at the mid-century in Mexico, there was La Reforma, the Reform. It was a liberal uprising at mid-century. They finally got rid of Santa Anna. He got him out into exile in 1855. Benito Juarez became the governor of a Mexican state of Oaxaca. I've been to Oaxaca. It's one of the most beautiful cities in Mexico. Great food, by the way. So he was a Zapotec Indian in the Mexican state of Oaxaca. A neighbor lady liked him and took him under her wings and made sure he learned to read and write. Eventually sponsored him to study law, and he rose to the ranks and became governor of the state of Oaxaca. In 1855, the Juarez Law was passed, which attacked military and ecclesiastical fueros. Fueros means exemptions. So everyone gets taxed, but church, clergy, and military officers are not taxed. That's a fuero. So that was abolished, and they had to start paying taxes. 1856, the Lerdo Law abolished collective landholding. Now this requires some explanation, which I don't really have time for, but the Ley Lerdo, basically the idea of the liberals was to free up land to be owned privately, and that, of course, in the liberal theology would usher in the utopia of the capitalist free market system. The only problem was it was devastating for indigenous communities, which had operated for a millennia on the idea of collective land ownership and usage. And all the indigenous communities had collective lands that they called ejidos, which were owned and managed and farmed collectively by the village. And this forced them, the indigenous people, to begin breaking up those ejidos. And once they were in private hands, once they were owned by indigenous people privately, they became prey to a lot of economic malpractice or business malpractice, where big haciendas were buying up these lands that belonged to Indians. So in this case, the liberal idea was devastating for the indigenous people. So in 1858, the conservatives reacted and rose up in a civil war against the liberals, and they lost the civil war. This is going to be kind of an old story. We'll see something similar in Nicaragua, only it was the liberals who lost. The conservatives lost in Mexico, and during this time, Spain, France, and Britain collectively occupied Veracruz to demand the collection of debts that were owed to them by Mexico. Once the conservatives lost as sore losers, they basically asked the French to intervene and to send them a monarch. So the conservatives wanted a French monarchy in Mexico. I told you Mexican history is probably the most fascinating history in Latin America. And so the French, Napoleon III obligingly sent over, let me see if I have his picture here. Yes, Maximilian Maximilian. He was an Austrian archduke, I think. And he was of royal blood. And so Napoleon III sent him over with a French army of occupation to ally themselves with the conservative Mexicans and establish a Mexican monarchy with a French monarch. Oh, by the way, I call this picture on the right Maximilian in a box, because he came to an unhappy end. The Mexicans rose up in a fit of national pride. Mexican peasants barefoot with machetes, fighting against the French, and they defeated the French. The U.S. Civil War ended in the United States, which means the United States could turn its attention to Mexico and demand that the French desist in their meddling in the Americas. And so Napoleon III brought his troops home. That was the end of the French support for Maximilian. He stayed on and tried to fight. His wife Carlotta returned to Europe. Maximilian, oddly enough, was a liberal by his political or philosophical persuasion. He was a liberal, being supported by the conservatives. And it seems that he generally meant well for Mexico, but in the end, he was caught and put before a firing squad and shot. And the national hero who led Mexico, actually, after Mexico City was taken by the French, he led Mexico from inside a carriage. With his secretary and with his papers, he would ride around Mexico in a carriage, governing as its president on the move. Benito Juarez, Zapotec Indian, has gone down as one of the heroes of Latin America. And you see him over on the right with Simon Bolivar, and I'm going to guess that that's Abraham Lincoln, maybe. And so he's become a real hero of Mexican history. And he was a member of the Liberal Party, as was Porfirio Diaz, who we'll come to later, who was a liberal general who actually defeated the French and Zacapoaxtla, which I've been to many times, with an army of Mexican peasants. And as often happens, today's liberal becomes tomorrow's caudillo and dictator. That's not a hit against liberals. It happens with conservatives too. Okay, so conservatives and liberals, I already talked about the French attempt at installing a French Franco-Mexican monarchy or empire. It was during this time, by the way, that the French invented the name Latin America. Now, why would you suppose they would want to call this territory from northern Mexico to the tip of Argentina Latin America instead of Spanish America? I'll pause briefly while you think about it. It's because that allows the French to insert themselves into this area in a way more conveniently than would be calling it Spanish America. Spain by this time was decrepit and declining, and was an embarrassment to many Spanish American leaders. And so around the same time, the French came up with the idea of Latin America, also in Mexico and in Colombia and Peru. There were a number of writers who started using the term Latin America, America Latin, because French is a Latin language. It's a Romance language, as is Portuguese and Spanish. So by calling it Latin America, you kind of bring Brazil in to the sphere of Latin America in a way that Spanish America does not. And you could even include Haiti, or the French islands. A question for your essay is, can you include Quebec as part of Latin America since it's French speaking? I'll let you wrestle with that one. So Napoleon III withdrew his troops in 1865, around the same time that the U.S. Civil War ended, and that was the end of Maximilian. In Central America, I think I already showed you this picture. In Central America, you have Rafael Carrera, who I talked about last week, was a Guatemalan strongman, caudillo, who was the ruler of Guatemala, and he basically brought an end to this United States of Central America, or the United Federation of Central America, which they had been attempting to create before he came along. Now, this brings us to another interesting character, quite fascinating for me. There's a wild movie about this guy called Walker, played by Ed Harris, who actually looks eerily a little bit like this guy. And William Walker was a filibusterer, or a mercenary. And this was a period of time when there were a lot of U.S. mercenaries or filibusterers attempting to foment revolt in countries and places like Mexico. Walker himself went to Mexico and tried to take over parts of Mexico. Then he did the same thing in Nicaragua. There was another guy who did this in Cuba, and I can't remember his name at the moment. But Walker was he was a very fervent Christian, and he was an avid a supporter of slavery. And his idea was, he first tried to break off part of Mexico and bring it into the United States as one more slave state, unsuccessfully. And so then he was invited to Nicaragua and attempted the same thing in Nicaragua. And the idea was at that point there was an equal number of slave states and free states in the United States Senate. And as you know, if you follow politics currently, having an equal number is not a good idea because you can't get anything done. So they wanted to add some slave states. And at one time or another, it was attempted to add Nicaragua as a slave state to the United States. Cuba was also attempted to be added as a slave state. This was all before the Civil War ended that discussion. So the Nicaraguan conservatives and liberals had a civil war similar to what happened in Mexico, but in this case, the liberals lost and the conservatives triumphed. So the liberals, thinking, not learning from history, invited a few dozen mercenary adventurers from the United States to come in and ally themselves with them and set up a liberal slave state. Okay, help me out here. This is all this stuff is too paradoxical to get your mind around. Walker was a visionary fundamentalist and Christian from Tennessee, and in his own eyes, he was a missionary of progress. I'm not even going to comment. So this liberal plan backfired when Walker attempted on his own initiative to colonize Nicaragua for the United States. With liberal support and force of arms, Walker briefly made himself president of Nicaragua and legalized slavery. If you can find the movie Walker, I encourage you to watch it. It's kind of crazy because, well, I won't spoil it for you, but it's just a wild movie. And yeah, that's all I can say about it. So this is a lady in a litter. Just a picture from your book about the traditional role of a lady whose biggest job was probably supervising her slaves. And the elite women didn't even walk for themselves. They were carried. So these are a couple slaves who are carrying her about. And I don't recall where this is Brazil. Yeah, most of the slave pictures come from Brazil. In 1842, President Francisco Morazan attempted to form the Confederation of Central America, which included El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. It lasted for 2 years. Just think if he had been successful, or if the United States had attempted to assist him, our immigration problem may be entirely different today. If woulda, coulda, shoulda. It's futile to try to speculate what would have happened if history had been different, but we could have avoided some major problems if he had been successful. That was in 1842. In 1852, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua created the Federation of Central America. In the 1880s, Guatemalan President Justo Rufino Barrios attempted to reunite the nation by force of arms, and in the 1880s, and he was killed in the process. 1896 to 1898, there was a union of Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, known as the Greater Republic of Central America. In 1921 through 1922, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica formed a Federation of Central America. That was the second time for the Federation. The treaty establishing this federation was signed in San Jose, Costa Rica in 1921. Of course, I've already mentioned from 1856 to 1857, the American adventurer, filibusterer, mercenary William Walker, born-again Christian, and slave supporter. All right, my little control's not working here. So now let's talk about progress for women. This is another section of the chapter. What did progress mean for women during this period of time, 1850 through about 1880? Liberalism led in positive directions for women, expanding their life opportunities. During the mid-1800s, however, few Latin American women benefited from these changes. Education for girls expanded slowly in domestic, while still hemmed in the lives of decent married women. This was not so much true among the lower classes, but among elite classes who were concerned about their image and their honor were very definitely hemmed in. Few women were able to play public roles in the 1800s. Those who did, however, could thank liberal progress. Looking back on these pioneers, most people thought them strange. The few women who became famous in their own right did so in the world of letters. And that means in the world of literature, education, writing, poetry. One such woman who was a Cuban, Gertrudis Gomez de Avellaneda. No, I pronounced that wrong. Avellaneda. Gertrudis Gomez de Avellaneda. Some of these names are hard to pronounce. You should see me in the classroom calling out the roll call in Miami. She left her native Cuba at the age of 22 and wrote her celebrated poetry, plays, and novels in Spain. Latin American literature claimed her early nonetheless. In 1841, she published a novel that was banned in Cuba. 1841. Remember, Cuba is still not an independent nation in 1841. The chief protagonist of the novel is Sab, S-A-B, a Cuban slave in love with a white woman who owns him. Sab has to watch her marry a blue-eyed Englishman who is cruel to him, but the slave still sacrifices his life for her. Here's a picture of Gertrudis. Gertrude in English. Wait a minute. I must have passed her up. There she is. Gertrude. I'm just going to say Gertrude. I haven't read this book yet. It's on my list, my short list of Latin American novels that I want to read. I do teach a class called Latin American History Through Literature, which basically covers the 19th and 20th centuries. I'd like to teach that class again, and this is a book I'd like to read and possibly offer in that class. There was also Juana Manuela Gorrite of Argentina, who was another of the few Latin American women whose talent won her fame in the 1800s. Gorrite's writings were feminine and instructive rather than scandalous. More than Avellaneda, Gorrite concerned herself with women's issues. It is her life rather than her writings that inspires us today. So, at mid-century, the plantation slaves in western Cuba grew nearly a third of all the sugar sold on the world market, and Cuba was still a land of opportunity for the ambitious peninsular Spaniards. From the opulent dukes and duchesses to officious royal bureaucrats, ill-paid soldiers, and store clerks. The royal Spanish governor of Cuba ruled with an iron hand, and when a Cuban patriotic spirit arose in the 1860s, he suppressed it savagely. This was the 10 Years' War, which began in 1868 and went for 10 years, oddly enough, with that name, from 1868 to 1878, when the Spanish forces were able to contain the eastern Cuba away from the big plantations, partly by building a fortified line all the way across the island. As I've heard, they dug a ditch from the north down to the south of Cuba and kept the revolutionary forces from crossing that ditch. During the war, a Cuban revolutionary newspaper in New York reprinted Saab. I'm going back now to Avellaneda and her book Saab. A New York publishing house reprinted Saab for patriotic readers. New York was one of the largest locations of a expat Cuban population living in the United States. Here's another influential woman, Clorinda Matto de Turner, wrote Birds Without a Nest in 1889, another one on my short list that I want to read. One of the most important early Latin American novels about indigenous people. Earlier literary views of Latin America's indigenous people had presented them as romantic savages of some quasi-mythical past, but Matto de Turner's book depicted them as poor Peruvians inhabiting the present. Like Avellaneda's Saab, the novel tells a story of an interracial love affair, in this case between a white man and an indigenous woman. There must be a dozen books like this in Latin America in almost every country, which tells about an interracial love affair. And one literary theory about this is that as these writers were attuned to their nation's challenge of building a sense of national identity, they realized there was a rupture, a trauma between their various demographic portions of their population, such as their Afro-Brazilians or Afro-Mexicans and Afro-Cubans and indigenous Brazilians, indigenous Mexicans, and that these populations have been so screwed over by white Europeans that there needed to be some kind of national reconciliation in order to become a Mexican, in order to be a Brazilian, to have a sense of national identity. These different demographic groups had to kiss and make up. I'm not trying to trivialize this. And so there was a whole bunch of romance novels that were written towards the end of the 19th century depicting this process of romance between often a white male European and a woman of color, either indigenous or African, and kind of wishfully thinking, can't we become one big happy family? And of course, most of them end tragically, because the truth is we can't. There's too much baggage to try to overcome. So that's Clorinda Matto de Turner. And I'm trying to back up here. So the book talks about some of the examples of liberalism in some of the different countries, and one country is Argentina, and you have three giants of liberalism who were the founders of Argentina. On the left you have Juan Baptista Alberdi, in the middle you have Bartolomé Mitre, and on the right you have Domingo Faustino Sarmiento. These three Argentine leaders, Alberdi, Mitre, and Sarmiento, had spent long years in exile during the Juan Manuel de Rosas dictatorship. And this was between the 1830s and the 1840s. These men typify the liberal love for Europe and the liberalism's close link with written culture, education, books, newspapers, poetry. Argentine liberals dedicated themselves to transforming the Argentine people, culturally through education and physically through encouraging massive European immigration, which was an attempt to whiten the Argentine population by trying to get more Europeans to immigrate to Argentina. And they were largely successful. Juan Bautista Alberti, around 1852, spent most of his life in exile and was most influential through his writings. Bartolomé Mitre was a man of action. In addition to being a writer, he became the first president of a unified Argentina in 1862. Domingo Faustino Sarmiento was an author of Argentine classics and followed Mitre into the presidency in 1868. There's more I could say about Sarmiento, but I don't have time today. Brazil had its own typically Brazilian problems with liberalism. It was still a monarchy. Here we're going to see some paradoxes. It was a monarchy, and the monarchy is an anathema to most liberals. They prefer a constitutional republic. It also was the longest lasting slave-owning society, also ostensibly an anathema to liberalism. Slavery is not a liberal concept, although as you'll find, there are plenty of paradoxes in history. These were two obvious contradictions to liberal thinking. Brazil also had a large free population of African and mixed descended people that made up-to-date liberals influenced by European scientific racism shake their heads sadly as if announcing a terminal illness for the entire country. If Brazil could go liberal, anywhere could. And as often happens, war became the catalyst for change. And we have a picture of Dom Pedro II, which I think I showed you last week. Brazil's second and final emperor was a moderate and enlightened ruler who quietly stepped aside to allow the formation of a Brazilian republic in 1889. One of the better leaders of history, actually. So, the War of the Triple Alliance was the catalyst that brought liberalism into dominance in Brazil. This was a bizarre war that happened in 1865. It lasted 5 long and brutal years. It was the most terrible war ever fought in South America. It was a fiasco for the winners being Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. They won, but it was not, how can I say this? They didn't benefit much from the war. It wreaked utter devastation on Paraguay, who was the loser. The Paraguay was under the dictatorship of Francisco Solano Lopez. Many people believed he was insane. He wouldn't surrender, he wouldn't negotiate, and he actually kind of provoked the war to start with. Victory over that small Spanish-American republic had come so slowly and at such a cost as to call Brazil's supposedly superior civilization into question. And for many Brazilians, the crusade against the Paraguayan tyranny rang hollow with the presence of Brazilian slavery. In fact, a large portion of the Brazilian army were slaves. And so this created a lot of problems of perception and discontent within Brazil, as you might imagine. The Brazilian elite endorsed liberalism in principle while embracing conservatism in practice. Then in the 1860s, times began to change in Brazil as elsewhere. A number of conservative leaders were convinced for the need for reform, especially of slavery, and they broke ranks and left the conservative party and joined with the liberals. In 1871, the conservative government caved into liberal pressure and enacted a free birth law. Slaves would remain slaves, but their children would be born free. Obviously, over a period of time, eventually that would eliminate slavery, but very slowly. However, in 1886, the Spanish abolished slavery in Cuba, which was left the embarrassment of Brazil being the only country left in the world to be endorsing slavery on a large scale. So you see the timeline here. 1880s, there was agitation. 1886, Spain ends slavery in Cuba. Brazil bears the shame alone. 1887, the Catholic Church finally said, okay, slavery's probably not a good idea, and ended its support for slavery. That blows my mind. The more I learn about history, the more unhappy I am. 1887, well, that's 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law ending slavery in Brazil. Finally, the last major country of the earth decided to end slavery. She signed the law because Dom Pedro II was in Europe at the time for medical reasons. The remaining 700,000 slaves were freed, ending 350 years of Brazilian slavery. On the right, you see a picture of Joaquim Nabuco, who was a prominent abolitionist and liberal. So this brings us to our vocabulary. You can look on the PowerPoint in your Canvas shell and look at the vocabulary. You need to make sure you know this vocabulary. And there's also some questions for discussion for you to consider. I won't take the time to go over them because I've gone too long already. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm still in Maryland, but we'll be heading back south to Miami in about 2 weeks. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the start of the semester. Hope you have a good rest of the summer, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.